faces online from a lot of people online from outside Western Australia, so welcome. Had a lot of interest, Paul, from the shoe list, and quite a few apologies because it's 5 o'clock in London when it's going. And but anyhow, so it's good to see that there's interest. In view of that, we're recording it. We'll place it to LMS to a website so that our colleagues around the world can view it. So Paul Oslington's a professor of economics and theology at Alphacrucis College. More importantly than that, I think, well, perhaps not from Paul's perspective, but from my perspective and my colleagues, is that Paul's a leading figure in the history of Economic Thought Society of Australia. He's had a long association with that body and has, brought views on international trade and also on the religion, the economics of religion and the religion of economics to many HETSA conferences, which has been very enlightening for us. And he also brought Murray Kemp one day, so we get to experience firsthand some deep thinking in international trade. So Paul has published a number of books on those areas. So Theory of International Trade and Unemployment, Adam Smith as a theologian. I remember Paul addressing this question of Smith and Providence in conference in the past, which have been very interesting. So I'm delighted to introduce Paul to the Economics Department and to the History and Philosophy of the Social Sciences Network for his seminar today on Theory of International Trade, a history. So Paul, we're in your hands. And if you can speak for about an hour or whatever you wish, but we'll allow about 15 minutes for questions at the end. And if there's quick qualification questions along the way, if you're happy to take them, that'll be great too.
Sure, that all is all good, Michael, and thanks. Thanks for the invitation to present something. It's you didn't mention that I'm a member of the History and Philosophy of Social Sciences Network at UWA, so a very good initiative, and thanks both for the invitation and your and others' initiative in getting it off the ground. It's an important thing. So talking with Michael about what I should present today, we ended up settling on something on international trade, although it's a book hopefully for the CUP Historical Perspectives on Modern Economics series. So when Crawford Goodwin was still with us, it was discussed extensively with him, and now with Haro Mas taking over, Haro's keen to have it. So hopefully it'll appear there. It's at an early stage though. It's something I've been thinking about for 20 years plus and reading around. So I think the next couple of years is really the time to knock it over. And I thought it would be, we settle on this as probably the thing that would be of most interest to the historians of economics and the economists at UWA. But it is a project still which is a way off completion. So I think the slides from today, Michael is going to share afterwards. I don't have a manuscript to share with you, but here goes. And I thought I'd preface the discussion of the book with a few comments about the state of the history of economics in Australia, because they're not unrelated. Now, what I'm trying to do with the book, in some sense, reflects some of the dilemmas that the history of economics in Australia and elsewhere faces. So at one level, the history of economics internationally appears to be flourishing. There's several societies, of which HETSA in Australia, which Michael mentioned earlier, is one. HETSA conferences happen once a year. We're hoping to have a face-to-face conference in November. There's a growing number of history of economics journals. Less and less history of economics is published in the mainstream journals, but there's a flourishing intellectual community around the societies and the journals. And there are many centres around the world. The preeminent one, I think everyone would agree, is the Duke Centre for the History of Political Economy, started by the aforementioned Crawford Goodwin and led these days by Bruce Caldwell. But a number, especially in Europe, the history of economics, while I think in experiencing tough times in the main research universities in the Anglosphere, it's flourishing in Europe and Latin America. But it's unloved by contemporary economists. Now, there's a growing divide, I think, between the economics community and historians of economics. It's not part of the professional training of economists at the top US graduate schools, and I think that filters down to Australian research universities largely follow the lead of the US universities. So as it's become less and less loved by economists and increasingly separate from mainstream economics, one place the history of economics could go is to, in the same way as the history of science is no longer part of science, that has become its own subdiscipline, the history and philosophy of science. Now, economists could join the historians and philosophers of science. I imagine there's different views around the Zoom room about the scientific nature of economics, but many of us like to think of ourselves as doing science, and that is one possible future for the history of economics, to join up with the history and philosophy of science community. And there are small steps towards that. Economics has had a difficult relationship with the wider intellectual history community. We can talk a little bit about some of these things if people want to in question time. But I think it would be somewhat sad if the history of economics lost contact with mainstream economics completely. I think it's a loss for the history of economics, because I think you'd lose a lot of the capacity to engage with more recent economics, which is mathematical and statistical. It's hard to see the largely humanist-oriented discipline of intellectual history tooling up sufficiently to really grapple with recent history of economics. I might mention here that one misapprehension about the history of economics, which has been really problematic, has been the misapprehension that the history of economics is somehow associated necessarily with opposition to the mainstream. If we're going to be studying, I think, trying to understand the history of the discipline, we're really trying to understand the history of the mainstream discipline more than any other part of the discipline. And it really is essential, if we're going to be doing that, that we keep historians of economics in contact somewhat with the mathematical and statistical methods and culture of mainstream economics. I think it would be a loss for historians of economics to lose contact with the economics discipline, but I think also for economists. I think economics is poorer without an awareness of its history, both in teaching and in research. The situation in Australia mirrors what's going on in the rest of the world. John Lodewicz, my friend, has written a number of perceptive articles about the future of the history of economics. In fact, the future of economics as a discipline within Australia. One of those I've referenced there, but it's I don't think I misrepresent John to say that his argument is it's a pretty grim future. I think if we extrapolate current trends in the history of economics, but there are signs of hope. I think the UWA network, which is co-sponsoring the seminar, is a real sign of hope. The leading centre in Australia, Peter Groeneweghen's Centre for the Study of History of Economics, History of Economic Thought at University of Sydney, closed with his retirement some years ago. And there's been a few attempts to revive that centre by past students of Peter, but thus far have not come to anything. I think the other place where there's lively scholarship in the history of economics besides Perth is in Peter Harrison's centre at UQ. And there is some synergy with PPE programs, but I think there is potential in Australia, and I guess this is a bit of an advertisement, but I think there is scope for UWA really to pick up the ball which some other places have lost, and to build a really high quality centre for the history and philosophy of the social sciences. There's an opportunity to collect together historians of economics from around Australia at low cost, because many of them are on superannuation, but are still active scholars publishing in top journals. It's interesting that the history of economics is still part of the economics codes for ERA purposes, although it's dual coded in economics and in history. Now, there's a very good track record of winning ARC grants and other grants from private foundations, competitive research grants in the history of economics, a disproportionate number in the history of economics compared to other disciplines. And I think a great chance to attract philanthropic funding in trying to restart Peter's Centre in Sydney. And one of the things that was interesting was that many of Peter's students had become leading lights in the finance industry in Sydney. Most notable of them, Glenn Stevens, the former Reserve Bank governor, who is still the patron of the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia. So there's, I think, a lot of potential in terms of publications, grants and funding for UWA picking up the ball that some other institutions have dropped. Now, the book that I'm writing in some ways reflects this dual mission of the history of economics, with one foot in the world of intellectual history and one foot in the world of economics. I'm trying, and this may be foolish or impossible, my aim is to both engage working trade economists and wider intellectual history readers. Economists are the most obvious audience for a book like this, but I also want to invite intellectual historians into the conversation about the development of economists thinking about international trade. Now, I think there's a need for a book like this. It's staggering that the standard work remains Jacob Weiner's 1937 book. There have been a few contributions which are on the slide there since then. Doug Irwin is an excellent historian, but by his own mission, his work is on the history of trade policy rather than the history of the underlying theory. And many of the subsequent contributions have been by Weiner's students, most notably Arthur Bloomfield. But there's a collection of other works there which tend to focus on specific aspects of the theory. And Magnuson's work, for instance, is really on trade policy. None of them are a comprehensive history of the evolution of economist thinking about international trade in the same manner as Weiner's book. And in fact, most of them most of the subsequent literature depends heavily on Weiner, especially for the early period. So there's a real need for it. I'm hoping that the book will stand alongside the June Flanders book on international money and finance in that Cambridge Historical Perspective series. Just a few words about scope. Weiner, in the introduction to his book, does comment that the absence of methodological reflections from international trade literature is not something to be lamented. But I think a few comments about what I'm trying to do are helpful without getting into extended discussions of methodology. But my sympathies are very much with the intellectual history approach, and actually I'm much more attracted to Quentin Skinner's version of that than Donald Winch's, even though, as you might have guessed from the references, I'm a great admirer of Weiner's work, and Donald Winch was Weiner's most or best known student. So although my sympathies are with Quentin Skinner's work.
I'm a student of Weiner's too.
Yes, I think Friedman was a master's student of Weiner's. There's a pretty distinguished list out there. I spent a year in 2007, not the whole year with Weiner's correspondence, but there's 130 odd boxes of it. And it's just absolutely fascinating. It's almost a history of 20th century economics, Ken, to read through Weiner's correspondence.
You could possibly add Paul Samuelson to that list too, although I'm a little bit less sure on that one. You would know?
Yes, and they carried on a correspondence right to the end, mutually admiring. Samuelson with enormous respect for Weiner's technical senses, even though Weiner, by his own admission, was a mathematical kindergarten child. But
he probably went to his lectures.
To
his classes at Chicago.
That's right. But then moved on to other things. But he was really started in his interest in trade by the contact with Weiner back in Chicago. So in terms of the canons of Skinner's intellectual history, I will be sinning in this book. I think sinning is inevitable if you're writing the history of a discipline. It's inevitable to have to sin against, particularly his commandment against teleology in historical writing. I'm trying, as I said, to write a history of economists thinking about international trade, and writing a broader history is, I think, just infeasible. So I need to determine one of the decisions I need to make is where I begin the story. And so you have to think about who is an economist. Various people who write histories of economics have come up with different answers. What my test is going to be is not whether someone was actually a professional economist, because the discipline of economics really only became professionalised in the mid-19th century, and the first chairs in economics were in the early years of the 19th century. But whether someone could be brought to recognise they're engaging in something that recognisable as the activities that later economists engaged in. It's going to be based on primary sources, and I think that's really important. You'll see later on in the slides this quote from Libanius, a 4th century pagan apologist. This quote from Libanius is the centrepiece of Jacob Weiner's argument in his studies, the book I mentioned earlier in 1937. Weiner's argument about there being theological influences on the early history of international trade theory. But the problem is that until last year, no one, and Doug Irwin and I had spent huge amounts of time on this, no one had actually ever been able to identify the particular passage from Libanius's works where Weiner got this quotation. And Weiner is meticulous usually. It was actually tracked down last year, but it's got a very different history to the history that Weiner imagined. And we'll talk a bit about that later, because it's just such a central passage in Weiner's arguments, and has been recycled in almost every subsequent work on trade theory. And they all cite Weiner without ever going back to the primary source or asking questions about what Libanius was trying to do in that text, etc. So there's, I think, a real lesson there in the importance of basing any history on the primary sources, going back beyond, I think, some of the mistakes of the secondary literature, particularly the more recent secondary literature on the history of trade theory. To make a book like this manageable, I'm going to be concentrating on the English language discussions and concentrating on the mainstream literature. There's some of the themes of the book. Trade theory is the oldest and, I think, the most influential branch of the theory. But among those themes, the one I'm going to be focusing in on in the limited time we've got today is the theme of the influence of theology on the development of trade theory. The argument that Weiner began, but I don't think really followed through, that the theological arguments for free trade preceded and shaped the economic arguments for free trade. There's a large literature on the influence of theology on economists. One of the issues in trying to take this discussion about theology and economics to the international trade literature is that even more, I think, than domestic trade, there's a long-standing suspicion within the Christian tradition of international commerce. But yet, despite that long-standing suspicion, there's a number of Christian doctrines which have been used in support of international trade. In the book of Genesis, in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Christian Old Testament, we're told that God blessed Adam and Eve and told them to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the earth. Now that's been a passage, we could spend hours talking about the subsequent impact of that passage on Western thought. But in relation to our theme of trade, Peter Harrison, I mentioned earlier, who's director of the UQ Centre, has looked particularly at the influence of that creation mandate in Genesis on thinking about colonialism. And colonialism and trade are intimately related. Now, I think there's much more to be said, following Peter Harrison's lead, on the connection between that hugely influential creation mandate and economists thinking about trade. The most important doctrine, though, for our discussion today is the doctrine of providence. And the doctrine of providence is the doctrine that as God has created this world, including human beings, the doctrine of providence is the doctrine that cuts in after the doctrine of creation. It's a doctrine about God's continuing care for creation until all things are brought to their eventual completion. This divine providence, this divine care, this divine sustaining, though it doesn't mean that everything turns out good. It's a preservation, a sustaining of the created order until all things are brought to completion. It doesn't mean that all is for the best. That the version of the doctrine was famously parodied by Voltaire in his Candide, and rightly so. The doctrine of providence is not a doctrine about all being sweetness and light. It's a doctrine of sustaining of the created order until all things are brought to completion. The doctrine of providence, of course, is not exclusively a Christian doctrine. There are Stoic versions of it, and we can't be too particular about this because the history of Christianity and Stoic thought are intertwined. The Christian thought is an amalgam of all sorts of influences, and the Stoic doctrine, and particularly the modern period, interacted with the Christian doctrine significantly. What I'm going to be doing in this part of the book is arguing that providence did indeed shape economists' thinking about international trade, but in a way that is a bit different and more complicated than the way that Jacob Weiner suggested. The version of the doctrine of providence that Weiner picks up is what he calls the universal economy doctrine. I'm sorry about the amount of writing on the slide, but I did want to give you the important passages here. And as I said, Michael will be making available these slides after the seminar. So the universal economy doctrine, as Weiner phrased it, the quote from Weiner's studies in the studies is at the top of the page. But what I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about is this quote from Libanius, a 4th century pagan orator, who Weiner regarded as being the key figure in the whole discussion about providence and international trade theory. The quote has an interesting history because Weiner quotes it from Hugo Grotius's Rights of War and Peace, published in the early 17th century. And the way the quote works in Grotius is arguing that there's some sort of a right to free trade, that the way God has organised the world, it creates a natural right to trade, and particularly to international trade. Grotius had his eye, of course, on justifying free trade, because the Dutch were then trying to muscle in on the Portuguese monopoly on trade with the East. Grotius was looking to collect all the authorities he possibly could in support of his right to international commerce. And so in that chapter of the book, there's pages and pages of collected quotations from all sorts of Christian authorities about the right to trade. Of course, nothing was more powerful in that period than quotations from Christian authorities, and one of those that Grotius deployed was Libanius. Libanius was not a Christian; he was a 4th century pagan orator, actually very critical of Christianity, and believed and lamented the influence of Christianity on the Roman Empire. Believed that influence would end badly for the empire. But you can see the quotation from Libanius there on the screen. So the idea is that God spread the resources of the earth unevenly. And why did God do that? Because God wanted us to trade. We all need certain things, and if they were in other countries, then we have to overcome our natural suspicion of foreigners and trade to get those necessities. And so the idea is that this providential, uneven spread of resources over the earth would encourage international commerce, and with that, friendly relations between the peoples of the earth. It's, as I said, Grotius wasn't too fussed about the original context of the quotations. But if you actually go back into Libanius' work, and I've spent quite a bit of time with Libanius, along with Doug Irwin, trying to search out where Weiner got this quotation. And Libanius is using it in quite a different way to the way that Grotius quotes it. It comes from Oration 59, which is this almost ridiculous flattery of the empire, of the emperor. The emperor is visiting Antioch, and the oration includes this passage right at the end, where the emperor is being praised for his the way he's facilitated free trade in the empire, and that's the way it's used. It's actually very hard to find similar ideas in Libanius' other orations. So to me, this is really an outlier, and I think it's flattery. It's hard to accept that this was actually a doctrine that Libanius was promoting. I'm not going to talk about it, but I've included another example of the universal economy doctrine there, which is perhaps even stronger from later in the 17th century, from the Popular Merchant Handbook. And that passage has been translated by Just Hingsmetal, who's written a really excellent book on providence in 16th and 17th century economic thinking. So that's the universal economy doctrine, the way that Weiner believes the doctrine of providence shaped international trade theory. So what I want to do now is consider the most influential figure in the development of economists thinking about trade, and that's Adam Smith. I'm a Smith fan, but I think he really is the most important influence on early thinking. So what I want to have a look at is the way that the doctrine of providence, in the form that Weiner suggests, that universal economy doctrine, or in other ways, shapes Smith thinking about international trade theory. I've given you the Weiner quote there about how Smith's thinking about Smith's free trade advocacy is shaped much more by his philosophical commitments than by the pretty terrible rant about mercantilism in part 4 of The Wealth of Nations. There's many other valuable parts of book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, but I doubt that Smith's treatment of Munn and others in book 4 would be accepted by one of our august history of economics journals these days. They'll be making comments about the terrible use of sources, the lack of citation, etc., etc. I certainly accept Weiner's argument that it was Smith's philosophical commitments rather than his reading of the mercantilist literature which pushed him to free trade advocacy. It was Smith's philosophical commitments combined with his observation about the damaging effects of less than free trade in contemporary Britain that shaped Smith's advocacy of free trade. But then if we need to ask what philosophical literature specifically influenced Smith, as I said, Weiner believed it was this universal economy doctrine. The problem is that it's very hard to find anything like a universal economy argument in The Wealth of Nations. The only passage that's remotely along these lines is the one I've mentioned there. Wealth of Nations doesn't quote Libanius or even Hugo Grotius's recycling of Libanius. Grotius is quoted in a couple of places in The Wealth of Nations, but for completely different reasons. And Gloria Vivenz's excellent work on the classical background to Smith thought is also silent on these. So I think the argument that the lines of influence from this universal economy doctrine to Smith's argument about free trade are murky at best. In my 2018 book, I argued that it was the Scottish Enlightenment moderate Calvinist version of the doctrine of providence that lay behind Smith's view of a beneficial harmony of interest in markets. The Calvinist background of Smith's thought has received a surprisingly less attention than it should have. In that book, I emphasised the Calvinist background of Smith's thought and the British scientific, the Newtonian natural theological background of Smith's thought. To give you a sense of the way these sort of influences work, there's a story in Genesis, at the closing chapters of Genesis, about the patriarch Joseph. The patriarch Joseph is, and his brothers are jealous of Joseph. Joseph is sold to slave traders who take him to Egypt, but he ends up after a series of adventures, the second in charge to the Pharaoh of Egypt. And then Joseph, after there's a famine in his homeland, his brothers come down to Egypt in search of grain from the Pharaoh. And Joseph is able to save the family from starvation, because he's now risen to 2IC, to the Pharaoh in Egypt. And this Joseph story is a staple of 18th century Calvinist thought. The idea is that although Joseph's brothers meant selling him to slavery for evil, it was a bad thing to do, yet God in his providence has worked this act for the good of Joseph's family and for ultimately the nation of Israel. So it's a trope about how an action which is morally wrong is providentially worked into a beneficial outcome for society. And Smith, in his work, is, in my view, transferring this doctrine from history to the economy. A twist to the doctrine is that human nature is also the product of divine creation and also under the control of divine providence. And there's arguments throughout the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations about how human nature, this created human nature, operates to support these providential, harmonious outcomes in Smith's system. And the providential basis of Smith's system is clearest in theory of moral sentiments, but it's not absent from the wealth of nations. And the books are part of Smith's system, which I think the scholarly consensus now is that it really is a unity. Older, particularly German scholarship, that emphasised the break between the thought of the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations is pretty well discredited. So in my view, the philosophical influences on Smith are this Scottish Enlightenment Calvinist version of the doctrine of providence that shapes his idea of beneficial harmony in markets, shapes his view of nature. Don't know what that was. And also, a Protestant natural law theory is operating. Now, this right to trade argument, which Grotius constructs, and I think misuses Libanius in support of. Remember that Smith's two predecessors in the moral philosophy chair in Glasgow were Gershom Carmichael and Francis Hutchinson, who were very much shaped by Protestant natural law thinking of Grotius and his successor Samuel Pufendorf. Carmichael actually translated Pufendorf into English, and the moral philosophy series of lectures was on a Protestant natural law template. So that's the providential influences on Smith. How do they actually play out now in his argument for free international trade? We have to understand that free trade for Smith doesn't mean quite what it means for us. It's multidimensional. It's an issue of protective duties, about bounties for exports, about trade treaties, monopolies, in particular the East India Company, and issues about colonial trade. So it's a multi-dimensional problem. It's not just about tariff reductions, as it tends to be for contemporary trade economists. And Smith doesn't separate nearly as much as contemporary economists do arguments about domestic and international commerce. As Smith builds his argument for free trade from the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, it's not just about Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, about systems of political economy, his critique of the mercantile system, where a lot of the literature starts when discussing Smith's views about trade. Smith's argument for free international trade builds from his discussion of the division of labour in Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations, is developed by his discussion of capital in Book 2, and a previous seminar giver, Keith Tribe, has made a real contribution there to helping us understand how important Smith's capital theory and Book 2 of The Wealth of Nations is to Smith's argument for free trade. So it builds in Book 1 and 2 the division of labour and the way capital moves in search of highest returns. Through Book 3, Book 3 is about the progress of opulence, and we read there about how this profit-driven allocation of capital is the real driver of international trade. So Smith discusses exports as a surplus, and imports are the reverse. Nations are trading their surpluses with each other, but where the level of production, where the variations in production are coming from, are from the allocation of capital in response to profitable opportunities between industries. Smith's particularly interested in the allocation of capital between manufacturing and agriculture. But the argument is building through Book 3. I've given you there a quote from Book 3. It's very hard to be making this argument just picking out a few quotations from Smith, but I've given you there an example from Smith about trade, mutually beneficial trade between the town and country. So when we get to Book 4, which is where a lot of trade economists focus their discussion of Smith and international trade, Book 4 is really just collecting together the arguments that he's made in the earlier books of The Wealth of Nations and ruling out any special pleading that things are different in international markets, the sort of special pleading that he sees the mercantilist authors making. So I've just given you a few passages there from Book 4. Now, I think one thing that's particularly interesting in Book 4 is that that's where the only message, the only invisible hand mentioned in The Wealth of Nations actually comes in Smith's discussion of international trade. But I don't think we can use that invisible hand passage as part of Smith's argument for international trade. I think the reference there means something quite different. It's that the invisible hand there is actually operating against the general providential force of markets in which would be sending Scottish capital overseas. The hand is actually operating because of capitalists' concerns about risk and about their capital being outside their control. The hand is actually operating according to special providence. The distinction between general and special providence is discussed in my earlier book and article, but I'm arguing that the invisible hand is actually operating against the general providential forces in Smith to keep Scottish capital at home. So it's just too attractive to use the invisible hand in support of Smith's argument for free trade, but I don't think it's actually in the end consistent with the text. And so you get in Book 4, after Smith's discussion of the errors of the mercantile system, you get this argument about capital allocation, the caveat about the invisible hand keeping some Scottish capital at home. Now, the argument culminates with this summary of the case for free trade. Viner, in his book, called this the 18th century rule. In subsequent histories of trade theory, this has become a statement of the so-called theory of absolute advantage. I don't think there's a very strong distinction between absolute advantage and comparative advantage. And comparative advantage, in my view, this is one of the other arguments of the book, which I'm just not going to get into today. The comparative advantage really comes through Ricardo's assumption that nations have particular endowments of labour. But in Smith's much more fluid and I think realistic version, where labour and capital are free to move across international boundaries, as something like this 18th century rule is equivalent to a theory of comparative advantage. It's interesting that Weiner, in his book, never talks about the theory of comparative advantage. He always discusses it as the theory of comparative costs, which he doesn't see as for practical purposes. That's Weiner's caveat. He doesn't see it as being, for practical purposes, as being any different from Smith's 18th century rule. Anyway, I suggest that Smith's general providential argument for free trade, for markets, transfers to international trade. And you can see that in some of the quotations. Now, the quotation I had up on the earlier page about the wise hand of God operating, you see some echoes of it in these Wealth of Nations passages. But the building blocks of it are in the earlier parts, and also in the theory of moral sentiments. But it transfers through, I argue here, to Smith's theory of international trade, but not in the universal economy form that Weiner suggested. I think trade thinking is shaped by the doctrine of providence, but the universal economy doctrine, grounded on that Libanius passage and some others, I don't think is the way that the providential influence on economists thinking about trade actually operates. So, a couple of conclusions in this small snippet of the argument in the book. Now, I reckon that a new history of international trade theory is needed, given that Weiner's book was written in 1937. So I'm spending a lot of time thinking about the earlier period and the philosophical and theological influences on economists thinking about trade. I also want to consider the more recent period, to have an integrated, up-to-date account of the development of economists thinking about international trade. I think that's needed. But just for the argument that the small part of the book, which I've given you a taste of today, I think that Smith's argument for free trade, along with his more general argument for markets, is shaped by the Christian doctrine of providence, though, as I've suggested, in a little bit of a different manner to the way that Weiner argued the connection operated. The value of these seminars, of course, is not hearing from me at length, it's the discussion. So I'd really value comments on the larger project or on the particular argument about providence and international trade that I've offered today. And I think we've got about 20 minutes for that, Michael, if my calculations.
Yep, that's right, Paul. Thank you very much for your presentation. And you're right, it's the best to have some discussion. So if you put up your hand or if you call out, because I'm not sure I can see everyone on my screen, but while that's happening, I might start. Can I make an observation that Libanius quote might well apply to thinking of, colonialism or mercantile type thinking? That is about engagement, extending your influence, not necessarily the mutual gains from trade that may occur. At least that's what occurred to me, that I could sit within a mercantile framing.
Yes, I think though that the sense of that quote, there's not a colonial power and someone else that you're trying to subdue. The sense is that it's symmetric, that the resources of the earth are spread over the earth, and that therefore our nation and another nation have to interact with each other in spite of the natural human suspicion we have of people from other nations. The sense I get from it, Mike, from that Libanius quote and from the other universal economy quotes is it's something, there's a symmetry between the nations. It's not a colonial power and another one. But was there a particular part of that quote that would caught your eye, Michael?
It's not. It just seemed about openness rather than, you know, a mutual. Free trades are usually argued on a mutual benefit. So I could see the engagement side, but not necessarily the mutual benefit. And perhaps it was the context of, of the, you know, the empire context of which it was given. But that was the reason why I raised it.
It's not an argument that there are economic benefits from trade, this Libanius quote or the Savary quote. And they're not arguing that. He's just arguing that trade, there is a reason, a non-economic reason for trade, that the trade, that God has spread resources over the earth to promote friendly relations between nations and in some forms of it, the reduction of war between nations.
Good. Okay, thanks, Paul. Ken Clements has his hand up. So Ken, if you could ask Paul your question.
Yes. I find your presentation a bit speculative, I'd have to say. Tracing influences on people is one thing, but I think you come close to trying to impute motives to people. Now, I'd like to get your opinion on that, but also, you know, why can't we just be satisfied with trade being mutually advantageous? And that's what was driving Adam Smith, plain and simple. Or put another way, would the Wealth of Nations book have ever come into existence if Christianity wasn't there?
Yeah, it's
Over
not,
to you, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, one point I'd make about this argument is that I do have a doctorate in theology besides economics, so you can probably guess that I have some sort of commitment to Christian faith. But for me, this argument about theological influences on Smith, it's not any sort of argument for Christianity. To me, it's neither for good nor ill or any particular argument for Christianity that Christianity had influence on trade theory. Look, I just don't really care. The case for Christianity is made on all sorts of other bases. It's not some sort of, you know, attempt to get one up for Christianity over other systems of belief or anything like that. But what I'm trying to do is actually understand Smith. So, I mean, Ken, your project may be, or the trade theory project is demonstrating that on theoretical and empirical grounds that there are mutual benefits from trade. But my project as a historian is a little bit different. It's trying to, with my historian hat on, I've got my historian hat on sometimes and my economist hat on sometimes. I'm trying to understand what Smith was doing. I'm trying to understand what shaped Smith's thinking. And you asked the counterfactual question. If there had not been Christianity, or I'd rephrase that, or as if there had not been these particular influences, you know, these providential influences, whether from Christianity or from Stoicism, this particular tradition of Protestant natural law thinking, you know, I don't think we would have ended up with the Wealth of Nations but for these influences. I think there's many influences on the Wealth of Nations, but I think these philosophical, theological influences were, as Viner suggested, you know, absolutely crucial for forming Smith's arguments about markets and about free international commerce. I don't know whether that satisfies you, Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I should add that Harry Johnson, a very eminent trade economist last century, he had this self-depreciating joke that the University of Chicago was the only major university in the world that you could get a doctorate in both economics and theology.
It's not actually true, but anyway,
okay.
Most good stories aren't actually true.
It's true that Harry said it.
That is true.
Just call out if you can, because I don't think I can see everyone. Rod. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks, Michael. I want to follow up on Ken's comment because my thinking is the same way. Smith's arguments in The Wealth of Nations can be seen to be independent of whatever religion he believed in, if indeed he was religious. That you can extract all the invisible hand stuff and it doesn't make any difference to the argument. This is the line I've taken in a couple of papers I've written recently, one which are in opposition to your view, Paul, about the importance of providence in influencing Smith's thinking. My argument is that the invisible hand stuff is just irrelevant. Take out those passages from The Wealth of Nations, or indeed Theory of Moral Sentiments, and nothing in the argument changes. They're just rhetorical flourishes. So we have a difference between the logic of the argument and Smith's personal beliefs, whatever they were, we're not sure about that, they're irrelevant to the logic of the argument. I got more questions, but let's leave it at that one for a moment.
Sure. Well, first point, I couldn't care less about Smith's own religious commitments. I think Smith was pretty cagey about them, for good reasons, because it wasn't that long ago that Thomas Aikenhead was condemned to death by the Scottish Kirk for holding certain non-standard views within Calvinism. So Smith plays his cards pretty close to his chest about religion, and really it's impossible to know. It's probably impossible to know about anyone's religious commitments ultimately. And they're not, I don't really care. It's not an argument about Smith's religious commitments. It's an argument about the philosophical influences on Adam Smith thinking. I agree with you that you could take out the invisible hand references with virtually no damage to Smith's argument. And my argument about the invisible hand passages is that they're a bit of a sideshow. They're an ironic comment about something completely different. My argument is that this moderate Calvinist version of the doctrine of providence is shaping Smith's view of beneficial harmony in markets. And that's got nothing to do with the invisible hand passages in the TMS and the Wealth of Nations. So in some ways I agree with you, Rod, but I do, about the invisible hand passages, but I do stick to my argument that the documentation is really in the 2018 book and some of the earlier articles, that this providential Calvinist framework plus the Newtonian natural theology tradition was crucial for Smith's thought, and especially Smith's idea of there being some beneficial harmony in markets. But I should read your recent papers, Rod, which I haven't seen. So I'll look them up.
They're in ROPE, Review of Political Economy. It's Keynes and Smith.
Okay.
Well, I've got to respond to that, but let's leave that question. The other thing I wanted to raise was the line of thought that God endowed the regions of the world with limited and varied products and so forth, and that stimulated trade.
That's the universal economy doctrine of Weiner.
Okay, but you're not, I got the impression you were not rejecting that. Are you accepting that in some form?
I think I'm very sceptical about the Libanius quote for establishing that doctrine, because I think that's, if you actually look at the context in Libanius, it's pure flattery. it's interesting. One of the curious things about it is that two major figures in Christian thought, St. Basil and St. Chrysostom, were students of Libanius, and you can find strong universal economy passages in their writings, which is really curious, given that I just don't think that Libanius believed that. So it's a really complex story. But the most thing about the universal economy doctrine, but the point that I'm sure of, though, is that that universal economy doctrine was not important for Smith. I can't see any evidence that it influenced his thinking, and I can't see anywhere that Smith deploys something like a universal economy argument in support of free trade. So regardless of the murky background of universal economy ideas, I just don't think they're important for Smith. I think Viner was wrong about that.
All right, well, maybe I've off the point here, but what I'm going to suggest is there's a total clash between modern understandings of scientific understandings of how the world evolved and so forth, and they completely contradict any idea that there was regions endowed with varied and limited products that led to trade. The history of the Earth, so far as we understand it, has been one of cataclysmic geological changes in which we had dinosaurs in the middle of Australia and now there's desert and so forth. So there was no original endowment of regions. The endowments changed all over the place. And it couldn't possibly, you can't build an argument about trade developing out of differently endowed regions that were provided by God. If God provided anything, he provided a very tumultuous evolution of a system that just changed so much it destroyed civilizations and created others.
I completely agree with you about evolution. And I think the idea that God created the world in 7 literal days, as believed by certain American fundamentalists, is beneath contempt. Completely with you on that, Rod. But remember, as historians our job is not to understand whether the universal economy doctrine is true or false. We may have views about that, but our role as historians is to look at the influence of that doctrine on thinking about trade and other things. So we may think the doctrine is false, but the really important thing for understanding the evolution of thinking about international trade is the shape and the influence of that idea.
Thanks, Paul. We'll go to Rod Tyers if we can now. Rod's got his hand up. Sorry, you're muted, Rod.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yep. Yes.
Yes.
I guess I'm interested not so much in either the religious or the early philosophical origins of thinking about trade, but about the early 20th century changes in thinking about trade. And it seems to me that one of the important things about the early 20th century changes that took place with people like, Heckscher and Olin and so forth, was the counterintuitive nature of the conclusions they drew that make trade very difficult to deal with for people whose training is not very deep in economics. Now, that's not to say that there were not counterintuitive ideas emerging early on. Obviously, the theory of comparative advantage, the idea that a country that has lowest costs in producing everything would still have an incentive to import from a country that has higher costs. That idea is extremely counterintuitive. And it seems to me as an economist that amongst the many subfields in economics, international trade seems to have a lot of this counterintuitive stuff in it. And you know, you just think about the Rudzinski theorem, or other works from that early 20th century period, and what emerges is very surprising to people. I mean, very few people who haven't had training in economics would think about protection as necessarily being bad for the collective, and that this is something that requires some sophistication to deal with. I'm not certain this is true, but I think there's the possibility that this is very special about the theory of trade, as compared, for example, theories of industrial organization. You know, you can read Joan Robinson, and everybody's going to agree with Joan Robinson, right? Oligopolies and monopolies are bad, right? They hurt us, right? But it's not the case in international trade. It's necessary to argue in a very sophisticated way the idea that free trade is actually better than some form of distorted trade. I'm just wondering what your comment on that is. I know your focus is on the period before the 20th century, but my sense is that period is quite important.
Yeah, I agree with you, Rod. I think the early 20th century was absolutely crucial period in the development of trade theory. We had a transfer from the classical theory to a very different subjective-based argument for the gains from trade. Now, the value theory was, I think, some of the you can show that some of the changes in value theory in wider economics were actually driven by changes in the argument for free international trade in that early 20th century period. I think that the arguments between Ohlin and Weiner and Haberler were just so interesting in that early 20th century period and important for economics beyond trade theory.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I gave you a small snippet of something from the early part of the book, but I'm really interested also in that early 20th century period, and I'm really interested in some of the more recent developments in trade theory as well. But there's only a very limited snippet I can give you in the seminar today.
No, understood. Thank you.
Something that was a bit unfamiliar. But I think you're right too that the trade theory does offer some of the some really counterintuitive propositions. I remember Samuelson relating how he was asked by this physicist who was pretty contemptuous of economics, if he could name one proposition in economics which was true and non-obvious, and the doctrine within economics that he went for was comparative advantage.
Yeah.
And I think, as you allude, it's an economic idea which is not well understood by the general public. A lot of intelligent people just seem to have completely unable to grasp it, but yet it's such a key idea for economists.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting idea in that respect. And
Thanks, Paul.
I'm digging about the origins and the nature of economists' conception of comparative advantage in this book.
Thanks, Paul. We'll move to Sean, but before we do, just a question to keep in the back of your mind. What does that counterintuitive nature of trade theory mean for the thesis that there's if you like, a providential story? Providential doesn't seem necessary to resolve counterintuitive things, but I don't want to take Sean's time, and Sean's going to ask a question. You can perhaps think about it and we can chat about it after. Sean,
Sure.
If you'd like to raise your question.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Paul, for your thought-provoking talk. So here I have two questions here. So here I think you're talking about very fundamental issues now has been stripped away from the textbook. Okay, now many people think the market is a kind of a scientific principle, and just without talking much about the foundation of the market. But in the time of the Adam Smith, as you mentioned, okay, so his idea mainly can come from the some religious idea. So I'm just thinking, so here, do you think at the time Adam Smith really believed that actually the belief itself is the foundation of the market? That means, to be more specific, my question is, do you think Adam Smith believes the so-called invisible hand actually means the God? That means everyone believes the God, then the market can work. Just like if everyone, the church runs well, only everyone believes in God. By some token, the market runs well only when everyone believes the God can run and coordinate the behavior of individuals in that way. That is my first question, the belief foundation of the market. The second one is in the context of the this international trade. So this may lead to some conflict between the church and the state. Then back the time and how Adam Smith think about the right of the state, then under the market, and how to deal with the relationship between the church and the state, and what does the endowment really mean? Is not just maybe not just about the natural endowment, but also the endowment of this power of the state. And yeah, this is my question. Thanks.
Well, there's a lot there, Sean. Firstly, on the question about whether we need to believe in God for markets to work, my argument, just to be clear, is that certain theological ideas shaped Smith and other early economists' thinking about international trade. So it's not an argument about the punters out there having to believe in God for markets to operate. Smith didn't make that argument. Smith certainly believed that there was some element of trust, or as he puts it in the book, there has to be a modicum of justice for markets to, there has to be a baseline of justice and a certain level of trust in society for markets to operate. There's no argument whatsoever in Smith that that trust needs to come from religion. I'm not arguing, Smith wasn't arguing that belief in God was necessary for markets to operate well. My argument is a very different one about intellectual influences on Smith. So that was your first question, as I understood it. The second question about states and markets, I guess, is a huge question. I wasn't making any particular argument about that. And one thing we have to recognise, though, in all of these historical discussions is that Smith lived in a very different world to the world that we live. Now, for the purposes of my own argument, we live in a secular society. The number of people going to church on a Sunday is somewhere around 15% on a Sunday these days in Australia. In Smith, Scotland, that would have been pretty close to 100%. But more importantly, theological ideas were authoritative and were the basis of every intellectual discussion going on in 18th century Scotland. Very different situation to the situation that we're in today. And my role as a historian is to jump back to that context in which the ideas were formed. And that context is the framework for evaluating the channels by which ideas were transformed. And that's a very different framework to the framework that we're operating in today. So I think in somewhat of a non-answer to your second question, I just point out that whole issue about relation between the market and the state, as with any question, looks very different for someone like Smith looks very different for people in past centuries than it does for us today. I think it's important in even making a start in answering your second question to recognise that.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm just going to point out that we're now at 1:15, so it's formally at the end. I'm happy to stay on for those who wish to stay and just finish the discussion. I'd like to just invite those who have other commitments, because we're now at the scheduled end of the time. Please feel free to leave. There are some other questions. So Paul,